South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol departed for the Netherlands today to ramp up a chip alliance with that country, a semiconductor powerhouse. The country is set to initiate a pan-governmental supply chain control tower to lessen heavy reliance on imports of certain materials. This comes amid recent urea import concerns triggered by China. A global coordination office opened its doors today in South Korea to better support tackling health concerns like COVID-19 around the world. On this occasion, we hear from the nation's disease prevention agency chief on what role the country is able to play during global health emergencies. It's December 11th, 2023. This is News Center. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol today departed for the Netherlands to ramp up chip alliance with that country, a semiconductor powerhouse. On this occasion, our Oh Soo-young sat down with the Dutch ambassador for a preview.
Shared values will be at the core of South Korea and the Netherlands' evolving bilateral ties as they cooperate to build resilience against common global challenges. That's according to Peter van der Vliet, the Dutch ambassador to South Korea, ahead of President Yoon Suk-yeol's state visit to the Netherlands this week. The two countries upgraded their ties to a strategic partnership last year, amid geopolitical and economic tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, where 60% of the world's maritime trade passes through.
We are both top 20 open and high-tech economies that share important values, maintaining a rules-based international order, freedom of navigation, democracy, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. And these are not just nice-to-have values, they are, in fact, indispensable for our security and our well-being. So during President Yoon's state visit to the Netherlands, we will extend and broaden our relationship further, also into the political and into the security domain. For instance, by strengthening our bilateral defense cooperation and by working more closely together on issues of economic security and resilience.
As microchips are considered the lifeblood of core technologies that enable both economic and military prowess, Yoon told AFP in an interview published Sunday that Seoul plans to significantly boost semiconductor cooperation with major countries like the Netherlands, the United States and Japan. Not only would Yoon's visit enable stronger cooperation between world-leading chip equipment maker ASML and chip producers Samsung and SK Hynix, but van der Vliet says it would also foster links for broader innovation.
ASML is part of a larger Dutch semiconductor ecosystem with interests in Korea. And other Dutch equipment companies like ASM, which makes deposition equipment, and Besi, which makes packaging equipment, are also present in Korea. And the Netherlands is also providing chips for Korean electronics and automakers. So the Dutch semiconductor ecosystem also allows for many startups and small and medium-sized enterprises and knowledge institutes working on innovation and development of the semiconductor industry.
The two sides have also been holding exchanges in other areas crucial to economic security, like batteries, hydrogen, smart agriculture and defence technology, according to the ambassador. Amid concerns of technology being misused and undermining societies, he further underscored the two democracies' shared interest in not only leading innovation, but also establishing multilateral dialogue and norms to address ethical, legal and security concerns, especially in the military domain.
For example, how can we ensure that artificial intelligence distinguishes between civilians and combatants? How does an AI program come to its conclusions? And for example, when targeting, and who is accountable for military decisions? And that is also why we hosted the first big international conference on this issue, called ReAIM 2023, together with Korea. And that is why we are also very glad that the next summit, ReAIM 2024, will be here in Korea.
Going forward, the ambassador placed strategic importance on greater cultural exchanges in areas like film and visual arts.
South Koreans and the Dutch share a close affinity rooted in the essence of their small yet dynamic nations. And Both countries heavily rely on human resources and a shared commitment to finding very innovative and creative solutions to all kinds of challenges. And Koreans and the Dutch are both, I think they're very creative people, and creative people find each other.
Following Yoon's bilateral talks with Prime Minister Mark Rutte on Wednesday, the two will sign deals on key areas of cooperation, likely to include semiconductors, green energy and people-to-people exchanges. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
This past weekend, the National Security Advisors of South Korea, the United States and Japan met in Seoul at a time when the stakes are high on the Korean peninsula. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Bae Yoon-ji has an analysis of what it means for regional security and supply chains.
4 months after the historic trilateral summit at Camp David between South Korea, the U.S. and Japan, national security advisors from the three countries have agreed to new initiatives to better respond to North Korea's illicit cyber activities, which are used to fund the regime's nuclear and missile development.
We've also launched new trilateral initiatives to counter the threats posed by the DPRK, from its cybercrime and cryptocurrency money laundering to its reckless space and ballistic missile tests.
They also agreed to bolster defense cooperation through a real-time information sharing arrangement on North Korea missile launches. The three countries plan to start this by the end of this month.
I think the most important thing that came out of it is continued commitment to do real-time intelligence sharing, which has a very practical and significant impact in times of emergency.
The three officials also discussed North Korea's growing military cooperation with Russia and reaffirmed their efforts for the North denuclearization.
We reaffirmed North Korea's obligations to denuclearize and the prohibition of military cooperation under the UN Security Council resolutions on the North Korean issue. We also agreed to strengthen coordination among the three countries to ensure the thorough implementation of these obligations by the international community.
Meanwhile, amid growing concerns about supply chain risks from China, they also discussed ways to strengthen economic cooperation. The three officials outlined their joint commitment to work together to finalize a new supply chain early warning system. An expert says the increased cooperation between South Korea, U.S. and Japan in opposition to North Korea, China and Russia is expected to last for some time, considering that China is providing full support to North Korea, even though Pyongyang continues to violate UN Security Council resolutions.
This kind of a trend will be continued for a while, unless United States and China have come up with some kind of a very comprehensive agreement between these two countries.
Bae Yoon-ji, Arirang News.
South Korea is set to initiate a pan-governmental supply chain control tower to stabilize supply chains of key materials. This comes amid recent urea import concerns triggered by China, against which the authorities have decided to extend the tariff rate quota on the product. Lee Soo-jin explains.
South Korea is enhancing its supply chain management in response to rising concerns about its reliance on imports of certain raw materials. Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho held a meeting on Monday with related ministers where they discussed how to mitigate current and future supply chain risks.
Risks in the supply of items directly related to core industries and people's lives, such as urea, ammonium phosphate, and graphite, have recently been growing.
The government plans to establish a pan-governmental supply chain management committee by June next year that will oversee the creation and revisions to supply chain policies. During the second half of next year, the committee will also decide which raw materials and other economic items should be designated as essential economic goods. And the businesses that supply and produce these goods will receive government support for production and stock management. The government also plans to establish a supply chain stabilization fund with the Export-Import Bank of Korea sometime next year to provide financial support such as loans and investment for these businesses, with the size of the fund to be decided in the first half of next year. But a repeat of the urea shortage crisis in 2021 is unlikely. Prices of urea solution at gas stations on Thursday last week were around 1,602 won, or $1.20 per liter. That's within the regular national average price range of around $1 to $1.40. And around 96% of gas stations nationwide were confirmed to have supplies of urea solution. The government also said that it has secured more than 4 months of urea, up from its previous 3-month supply, thanks to recent contracts signed with countries other than China. It will also extend the tariff rate quota, which allows for a lower tariff rate on certain imports within a specified quantity on urea and ammonium phosphate. This quota was set to expire at the end of this year, but will be extended until the end of 2024. In a move to further ease the burden on companies looking for other suppliers, the government will provide partial financial support for shipping fees until April next year. Also starting January next year, the government will review long-term plans to establish domestic production facilities. 이수진, 아리랑 뉴스.
South Korea has seen its exports grow in the early part of December despite a drop in semiconductor exports. According to the Korea Customs Service on Monday, the total value of exports for the first 10 days of December stood at $15.8 billion. It's an on-year increase of more than 3%. An increase in exports of ships and automobiles largely contributed to this. In terms of monthly trade value, the year-on-year figure was positive for the second consecutive month, raising expectations that all of December may also see positive year-on-year growth. The number of marriages that reached a 5th anniversary in Korea has been dropping annually, with the trend continuing last year. According to data for 2022 by Statistics Korea Today, marriages that reached that anniversary fell over 6% to a little over 1 million. Since 2015, when 1.5 million marriages reached 5 years and data began to be compiled, numbers have been falling by around 50 to 80,000 each year. Among couples in their first marriages, 46% did not have children, an all-time high since 2015. The average number of children also fell to the lowest figure so far. Shifting gears, videos of hundreds of Palestinians detained in Gaza by Israeli forces are prompting human rights concerns. The Israeli army says it's conducting routine search procedures for explosive belts, while Hamas says Israel is arresting civilians. Lee Si-hoo reports.
Concerns over human rights are mounting while the Israeli military is searching and detaining hundreds of Palestinian men in and near Gaza. Images and videos circulating on social media show Palestinian men kneeling on their knees, stripped down to their underwear by the Israeli military. The Israeli military says many of the men are militants who have surrendered and that the search and detain procedures are necessary.
When we spot a group like this that has come outside and surrendered to us after we have called to them, we undress them because we are worried about explosive belts. It is something we have been doing for years during battle, because we have had incidents when people have detonated themselves upon our forces. So this is part of the process.
The army explains that after the investigation, they allow the people they've searched to put their clothes back on. It also says the pictures weren't distributed by the Israeli forces. However, according to the Wall Street Journal, a Hamas spokesman says that the images were of civilians arrested by Israeli forces, not militants who are surrendering. Meanwhile, the United Nations humanitarian coordinator for the Palestinian territories, Lynn Hastings, said Israel should grant the UN access to the prisoners so it can verify their condition. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
Over in the UAE, this year's Global Climate Summit is poised to end tomorrow, Tuesday, but countries still have to reach a consensus on phasing out fossil fuels, having met with opposition from some of the world's biggest carbon emitters. Shin Se-byuk has more.
At this year's annual UN Climate Summit, COP28, the crux of negotiations is the phased withdrawal of fossil fuel use. The conference is set to end on December 12th, but countries are clashing over the draft of adaptation goals. Some 80 countries have been able to reach consensus on the phasing out of all carbon-emitting fossil fuels. And the UAE, playing host this year, is rolling up its sleeves with high-ranking officials from attending countries to draw up an agreement.
It is our opportunity to deliver an outcome that is based on the science, led by the science, and equipped by the science.
This, however, is facing strong opposition, led by some of the world's biggest carbon emitters, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and China. These countries claim that the conference should only focus on reducing climate pollution, not the fossil fuels causing it. OPEC also openly opposed the formalization of a phased withdrawal and reduction of fossil fuels and emphasized the need for a realistic approach to solving the climate crisis.
There is no single solution or path to achieve a sustainable energy future. We need realistic approaches to tackle emission.
This has prompted wide criticism of OPEC and oil companies, among those advocating for the cutting of carbon emissions by reducing carbon fuels.
OPEC and the oil companies right now are trying to whitewash the crisis that has been created by fossil fuels.
The International Energy Agency, in its report released on Sunday, said new pledges to be made at the climate summit are indeed positive, but will not be enough. The IEA said the world is still off track to meet climate targets to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, despite pledges made by dozens of countries. Climate activists symbolically releasing fluorescent substances into the Grand Canal in Venice, Italy, called for action on climate change. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan will host next year's event, COP29, on the back of support from Eastern European nations from November 11th to 22nd. 신세벽, Arirang News.
During the 3 years of the COVID pandemic, recognition of the need for global cooperation grew. To accomplish this, the Global Health Security Coordination Office has opened in South Korea to better support tackling health concerns. And on this occasion, our Choi Soo-hyung talked to the nation's Disease Prevention Agency chief on what role the country is able to play during global health emergencies.
Over the course of the COVID pandemic, there was a growth in recognition of the need for cooperation between countries regarding global health security. To deal with these needs, the Global Health Security Coordination Office was opened on Monday in Cheongju City, Chungcheongbuk-do Province in South Korea. Commissioner Ji Young-mi of the Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency said that following COVID-19, trust in Korea's health crisis response system has increased, leading to various requests for cooperation from around the world.
The post-COVID-19 era demands that we move beyond discussions and take practical actions to fortify our preparedness and response scheme. As a leading country in global health security, the Republic of Korea is delighted to announce the inauguration of GHS Coordination Office.
Due to the absence of such an office in the past, it was hard to share effective management outcomes from international conferences or policies for health security.
There was no coordination of all those outcomes of the evaluations. So with this establishment of coordination office in Korea, I think it will be really very beneficial for countries to really strengthen the capacity for health emergencies.
A total of 71 countries and 10 international organizations are participating and will hold a ministerial-level annual conference on health and medical issues. Commissioner Ji noted that Korea was part of the leading group of 16 countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom and Netherlands.
I think we are ready to play a leading role to take the shared responsibility for health emergencies. Korea is a leading country in Asia, but we can also play a role for the world.
The new office will serve as an executive secretariat, supporting exchanges of health information between countries and international organizations, providing experts in different fields and offering educational programs, among others. In the future, it will establish specific action plans in the areas of prevention, defense and response, which will include immunization, antimicrobial resistance, biosafety, and legal preparedness. Additionally, the office will coordinate and evaluate each country's operations and proceedings as part of a global health security agenda. Choi Soo-hyung, Arirang News, Cheongju.
It is time to take a look at what's been happening in the world of sports. Joining us in the studio is our sports reporter, Steve Price. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
So first, let's start with football. The K-League season finished in dramatic fashion with the promotion relegation playoffs.
That's right. The final playoff matches of the season took place on Saturday to decide who will be in K-League 1 and who will be in K-League 2 next season. Suwon FC went into their match against Busan I-Park with an uphill struggle after losing 2-1 in the first leg on Wednesday. To make matters worse, Suwon's talisman playmaker Lee Sung-woo was suspended. Lee could only watch on as Busan scored early to extend their advantage to 3-1 over the two legs. But late goals from Kim Hyun and Suwon captain Lee Young-jae levelled the scores at 3-3 on aggregate and took the match to 30 minutes of extra time. Busan fell apart in extra time and Suwon scored 3 more goals to eventually win 6-4 on aggregate and secure their place in the K-League 1 for another season. In the other playoff match, following a goalless draw on Wednesday, Gangwon FC beat Gimpo FC 2-1 on Saturday to keep their place in the top tier of Korean football.
And staying with football, let's head to the English Premier League, where Son Heung-min has scored his 10th goal of the season.
Yes, that's right. He scored a penalty late in the game to complete Tottenham Hotspur's 4-1 win over Newcastle United on Sunday local time. Son also got 2 assists, setting up goals for Destiny Udogie and Richarlison in the first half, as Spurs got their first win in 6 games. Son's penalty kick in the 85th minute was his 10th goal of the season, putting him 3rd in the Premier League top scorers chart, and meaning that he's already matched his last season total in just 15 games. Son Heung-min has now scored at least 10 Premier League goals for 8 consecutive seasons, stretching back to the 2016-2017 season. Tottenham Hotspur are currently 5th in the Premier League and next face Nottingham Forest on Friday evening local time.
Now to speed skating. The 4th weekend of the ISU Speed Skating World Cup took place in Poland this weekend. What can you tell us?
Yes, and that was a good weekend for South Korea's Kim Min-son. She won a gold medal in the first of the 2 women's 500-meter races and a silver in the second. Kim grabbed gold with a time of 37.82 seconds on Friday and followed it up with a silver on Saturday. It's her 2nd gold of the World Cup, having also won gold in Norway earlier in December. Kim is now 2nd in this season's overall 500-meter women's rankings, behind the USA's Erin Jackson. South Korea's Chung Jae-won also finished in the medal places at the weekend, finishing with a silver medal in the men's mass start.
And finally to the Major League Baseball, where Shohei Ohtani has signed the biggest contract in the history of his team sports.
Yes, the Japanese star signed for the Los Angeles Dodgers in a 10-year deal worth $700 million. His move to the Dodgers makes him one of sport's top-paid athletes, and due to the contract length, the total value of the contract is the biggest ever. The 29-year-old pitcher and designated hitter has twice been named American League MVP. The Dodgers beat off fierce competition after Ohtani opted to leave his previous team, the Los Angeles Angels, when his contract there expired.
All right, thanks for the wrap-up, Steve.
Yeah, thanks.
After the spring-like weather we had last week, this week started with rain or snow in most parts of the country. This rain will gradually move away tomorrow morning. However, Gangwon-do province and the south coast can expect to have rain until the afternoon, and Jeju Island until the evening. Gangwon-do and mountainous parts of Jeju are under heavy rain warnings. As for the amount of rainfall, Gangwon-do will receive up to 150 millimeters of rain by tomorrow. There will be as much as 120 millimeters of rain on the east coast of Gyeongsang-buk-do province, and up to 40 to 60 millimeters in Seoul and other inland areas. In the mountainous areas in Gangwon-do province, where 15 centimeters of snow has already fallen, a heavy snow warning has been strengthened. This area will receive a lot of snow, seeing up to 50 centimeters by tomorrow. Morning temperatures in Seoul will start off at 5 degrees Celsius, Gwangju and Busan 11 degrees. Daytime highs in Seoul will get up to 10 degrees, Daegu, Gwangju and Busan 12 degrees Celsius. This week will be followed by some relatively mild winter weather. On Thursday and Friday, there will be more rain across the country. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is News Center for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up next.
오늘도 나 텅 빈 방 안에 계속 홀로 I just walking to you girl na 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 kick drum bang y'all ready go ready 우리 hit your bang 밤하늘 밖에 빛나는 별처럼 na 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 we go
This is K-Vibe. This is Korea.
시간이 지나면 완전히 흡수되는 녹능실 성분인 PDO 성분으로 만들어진 제품이라서 자연스럽고 안전하다고 합니다. 더 건강한 피부 컨디션을 유지하고 싶으신 여러분들께 추천드리고 싶어요.
Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Clusters of respiratory illness outbreaks are putting many countries on alert. South Korea too is not an exception. The KDCA reported the number of hospitalized patients with respiratory illnesses increased 1.6 times from the first week of November to the fourth week. Infections by mycoplasma pneumoniae, a bacterium that causes walking pneumonia, are reportedly common in school-aged children and could be resistant to some antibiotics. This is all raising worries about a potential pediatric care crisis as practices nationwide are already suffering from staffing shortages. What symptoms are caused by mycoplasma pneumoniae and how concerning are they? For an answer to this, we have invited Professor Kim Moon-gyu from Yonsei University College of Medicine into the studio. Welcome, Professor Kim.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Professor Peter Chin-hong from the University of California, San Francisco. Good to see you, Professor Chin-hong.
Good to see you again, Bo-kyung.
Good to see you. Now, first question to our Professor Kim. First of all, I would like to ask what this mycoplasma pneumonia actually is. I heard that somebody calls it walking pneumonia. Why is this?
Well, first of all, when we say pneumonia, I can say that it's kind of the respiratory infection, but the strongest type. So many people has to be admitted to hospital. Actually, there are many pathogens causing pneumonia, virus, bacteria, even fungus. And each specific pathogen have a different virulence, sometimes strong and sometimes mild. Mycoplasma is one of them, and usually it's just a mild infection. And compared to other bacteria such as pneumococcus, Haemophilus influenza, those bacteria have a very severe course, but mycoplasma pneumonia, sometimes it can be cured even without antibiotics in some patients. So that's why you can walk with pneumonia. So that's the reason we have a name like that. And long time ago, we used to call it atypical pneumonia because the clinical course was different. So the incidence is high among school ages and even younger. And in Korea, we had a surge of mycoplasma infection in 2019. It was about 4 years ago. So we had a pattern about 3 to 4 years. We had a surge of mycoplasma, and after 2019, we had a COVID-19 pandemic, and then we are in 2023. So I guess we are following this pattern.
All right, I see. Now, Professor Chin-hong, on top of what our Professor Kim already told us, how does this spread?
Well, Bo-kyung, it spreads through respiratory droplets. These droplets are heavy. They usually fall within 2 meters or 6 feet. So you can, if you stand far away, it's less likely to get it than if you are at close quarters. It's very similar to the way influenza is spread. So it's in that same kind of transmission. The incubation period is about 3 weeks, so longer than most respiratory viruses. But the attack rate is very high, meaning that if it's in a household, about 90% of the people will get it.
All right, I see. So it spreads through respiratory droplets. All right, now we know what this respiratory illness is and how it spreads. Now, Professor Kim, another important thing is correctly diagnosing it. And so I'd like to ask you about the signs and symptoms. Are symptoms different depending on the age group? And how is it different from when this illness is developing into a pneumonia?
Well, in the beginning, you cannot distinguish by symptom from other types of pneumonia or respiratory infection. So symptoms of mycoplasma infection is almost same, whatever the age of the patient is. And they include fever, coughing, and sometimes headache. And we start to consider taking chest x-ray if the symptom continues more than 5 days. And usually patients have an additional symptoms such as poor oral intake, or fatigue, and sometimes shortness of breathing. So usually the patients start to show symptoms of dehydration. In the case of mycoplasma pneumonia, sometimes we have some clinical manifestations out of the lung. We call it extrapulmonary manifestation, and it includes some skin rash, and sometimes we have patients with anemia.
All right, thank you for letting us know what the symptoms are. Now, Professor Chin Hong, we need to now know how to treat it. Some reports say that mycoplasma pneumoniae can be resistant to common antibiotics. Is this true? And what antibiotics do doctors usually use? And if the common ones do not work well, what are the alternatives?
Well, there is some resistance reported in different parts of the world. Around 7.5% in some studies. People are more likely to have resistance to commonly used drugs if they use a lot of antibiotics, if they're immune compromised, and sometimes if they have more serious disease. Some of the typical antibiotics we use are not the ones we normally use for pneumonia in some places. Like amoxicillin, so those don't work. So you have to use drugs like azithromycin or doxycycline. And in some cases, although we don't like to use it for children, quinolones like ciprofloxacin. So these are kind of drugs that we use for this specific kind of bacteria. So this is a bacteria, not a virus like influenza or COVID. So we use antibiotics for this drug. For this bug. So you think about resistance when a child, for example, is having fever for more than 48 hours, and you put them on a particular drug. So you have to use some of these alternatives. For example, if you use azithromycin to treat it, and maybe that child has used a lot of azithromycin before for treatment of other illnesses like ear infections, they may become resistant. So I think it's up to clinicians to really suspect resistance in the right patient and in the right context.
All right, I see your point, Professor Chin Hong. Now, Professor Kim, as we all know, it's winter season, and there are so many other respiratory illnesses, such as flu. I know that health officials pointed out that this mycoplasma pneumoniae has low fatality rate. But if a patient gets infected with other respiratory illnesses, would that increase this rate or contribute to pneumonia developing?
Well, if the patient is healthy and does not have underlying conditions, we don't have to worry too much about that. As you mentioned in the beginning, we have about 50 to 60% increase of respiratory infections compared to previous month. And I tried to find some reports about mixed infection in mycoplasma. And I found an article published in 2020 by Chinese doctors. And interestingly, they report that the mixed infection rate is more than 60%. So I don't know how they get that percentage, but in Korea, I don't have the exact data. But since we have a lot of diagnostic modalities in emergency department, such as film array respiratory panel test, we can have about 20 viruses and bacteria result at once, and we have the result within 1 or 2 hours. So yeah, we see patients with mixed infection, but each pathogen is not that virulent. But if the patient has a longer prolonged period of fever, patients get even sick, and they might have secondary problems also. So we have to be cautious about that. In an emergency department, we saw a few cases with mortality because the patient was bedridden, had the underlying disorder, and the lung condition was poor. And they found that the pneumonia was progressing at a rapid speed. So those kind of patients should be concerned.
All right. So mixed infection is possible, and in that case, we need to be cautious even more. All right. Now, Professor Chin Hong, We also need to talk about China's case. China has already been seeing a spike in the number of mycoplasma pneumonia infections. And as far as I know, this respiratory infection recurs every 3 to 4 years in Korea, as our Professor Kim already mentioned before. And though it could be different from the situation in Korea, why is China suffering from this outbreak so heavily?
Well, Pokyung, the situation in China is a little bit different from many parts of the world, primarily because they were one of the last countries to end restrictions for COVID. And what that meant was that population wasn't really exposed to a lot of viruses, but even to a lot of bacteria like mycoplasma for many years. So if you think about 3.5 years with restrictions, that means that particularly young children have never really been exposed to any of these kinds of pathogens. So we're not only talking about mycoplasma in China, we're talking about a whole host of other infections like COVID, like adenovirus, like influenza, like RSV. And, in an outpatient setting where you can have thousands of people in China in a hospital or clinic, they can have many of these other kinds of illnesses all at once. It's not common to diagnose mycoplasma in the clinic. So when somebody comes in with a respiratory virus, even though mycoplasma is higher, we know from the data, there's also a whole host of other infections that are increasing because of the lack of population immunity, because they haven't been exposed, particularly children, for the last several years.
Oh, right, I see. Professor Chin Ho, in that case, you already mentioned that China is actually quite under the special circumstance. So would that mean that the chances of mycoplasma pneumonia pandemic becoming a pandemic would be quite low?
Yes, it would be quite low in general, mainly because it's not a novel pathogen. It's something that, as you mentioned, we see every few years in a big spurt. But, we see a steady stream of mycoplasma, even in the off years. So it's not really gone away and then comes back. And it's not a new pathogen. So there is some level of population immunity to begin with. So that means that, you wouldn't really see it, lead to a lot of suffering and deaths like we did with COVID.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Kim, let's move on to proper responses South Korean government needs to make. Well, some watchers say the government's current response is quite complacent, and they added that KDCA's sampling survey is quite limited to hospital-level medical institutions with more than 200 hospital beds. What's your view on this?
Well, KDCA have a system to collecting data. And it's kind of a basis information structure for our health issues. And they collect data from the hospitals, more than 200 beds. And I think that can show, at least in part, the pattern of infection pattern in Korea. I guess if there's no new type of infection or no mutation, this situation is not a big deal, no big concern. But I don't know the hospital system in China, but if there are many patients staying together, many kinds of infections, they spread to one another, and that might come to neighboring countries. So the more earlier we have accurate situation of China, it's better for us to respond. I'm sorry to say that, but China lost some credibility at the early stage of COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
So we have a very limited data about mixed infection. Each one infection is not that serious. I mean, mycoplasma usually healthy people overcome it, but we don't know whether it's a kind of a new subtype or new mutation. I wish we can have that information more early. And also about the drug resistance. Korea has some level of antibiotics regulation, but I think China does not have it. And also Korea, a long time ago, we didn't have it. So I think I can guess the situation in China, but usually in that situation, people can get antibiotics at the pharmacy without doctor's prescription. That makes the incidence of bacterial resistance and antibiotic resistance higher. So if the pathogen is already resistant to antibiotics, it's become a little bit difficult to treat if we start with resistance.
All right. So you're saying that it is not as concerning as China's situation, but Professor, there are some of the people who are saying that the pediatric care crisis could happen, given that pediatric clinics and hospitals are already overwhelmed in South Korea because of the staffing shortages. How concerning is this, and what kind of proactive measures do you believe government should take to prevent this kind of situation?
Yeah, this morning I just came to know about Dokdak is kind of an application in the mobile that shows how the private clinic is crowded or not. You're going to wait a long time or not. Yeah, it's amazing for me. Anyway, during the pandemic, many private clinics, pediatricians has to close their clinic. And now we have a surge of this respiratory infection, and I think that's one of the reasons we have a overloading of the clinics right now. Well, fatality is low, so it's not a big concern. But as I mentioned, patients with underlying conditions, you have to be cautious. And well, in Seoul, the capital is a little bit better, but the regional hospitals in many parts of Korea, the situation is very worse. Right. So we need to more boost up the manpower, especially for pediatric intensive care units and emergency rooms. So I wish the government start to move to do something for this.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Chin Ho, preventing children from being infected with mycoplasma pneumoniae at home is also important. So what preventive measures could parents or guardians take?
Well, Puk-young, coming back to how it's transmitted, which is through respiratory droplets, some of the same strategies you use for prevention of influenza, COVID, and other respiratory illnesses also apply. So it's, you know, wearing a mask, particularly if the kid is ill or if you want to protect yourself from it, because it's through droplets. And so many masks will work, like a surgical mask. I think washing your hands, of course, because those respiratory droplets can fall on surfaces. You can touch a surface and then touch your nose or mouth. Staying home when you're sick or keeping your kids home when they're sick. And then finally, of course, vaccinating against all the childhood diseases, because again, you don't want to have co-infections, which may make things worse. You don't want to have the noise of the other infections. So prevention of the other infections for which there's vaccines, because there's no vaccine for mycoplasma pneumoniae, is also a good idea.
All right, I see. Well, thank you, Professor Chin Ho, for your advice. Well, hopefully everyone can follow such preventive measures and avoid the infection. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Chin Ho, and thank you, Professor Kim, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.